Hi, and welcome back to Codex. Our talks this summer feature graduate students and postdocs who were nominated to speak by their senior colleagues. Today, we have David Heffren, who is a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. David will be speaking on optimizing dimension to learn any dimensional manifolds. Take it away, David.
Hi. Yeah, I've been introduced. My name is David. This is a joint work with Soledad VR, and it's on learning any dimensional models. So it when we're doing machine learning problems, we deal with data, and many data types that we're dealing with are inherently any dimensional. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that um they can come in many different sizes. And for example, like you might have a molecule data set, and these molecules can come in different sizes because different molecules have a different number of atoms. And or another example is the ModelNet 40 data set, which is of a bunch of objects, like it's a bunch of CAD files of objects. And when you're doing machine learning on it, you need to sample a bunch of points from it to get a point cloud. But you can do machine learning regardless of the number of points you sample, and you want your methods to be robust to the number of points you sample. And you can see there in the second picture, that's an example from the ModelNet 10 data set, which will be relevant later. But what I'm alluding to here is that ML pipelines are often not any dimensional. And you can see that here, and how they deal with data is they often distort or crop or pad different data. Like you can see that little cat, poor cat down there. You can see in the first one, he was like stretched and resized. The second one, they padded zeros on the end of him so that you could get everything to be the same uniform size. And the third one, they cut off his head and cropped it so that you can get him to be the one uniform size. And so these are the kind of techniques they do in most kinds of data of differing dimensions, like images, like sequences. They pad on the end. And this is inherently kind of destructive. You're inherently getting rid of information in the data. You're not really respecting the dimension of the data. And for some examples like graphs, it's not obvious how to sample from it or to pad it or whatever. So the solution of this in a much simpler sort of approach is to use an any-dimensional model. And so what is an any-dimensional model? Well, basically, it's a model that is defined on a fixed set of parameters for all n. So see, we have one theta such that for all n, it parametrizes functions between these n sort of related to n dimensional vector spaces. So in your head, I want you to think of an example that this Vn is like a vector space that varies with n. An example of this is if you have point clouds in 3 dimensions, your Vn would be R3n, which means it increases with n. And so we want to learn one theta that works for all of these. And so the way we can sort of formalize this is we want to compare things in different dimensions. So what we do is we sort of identify implicitly a smaller dimensional vector space in a bigger one. And we do this through group actions. And what we can do is it allows us to relate data of different dimensions. And by embedding these vector spaces in each other sequentially, we can sort of define a limit space, V infinity. And that just lets us talk about all data of different dimensions in one space and let us compare them and do stuff with them. So that's a nice sort of formalization of this idea of differing data dimension. And so in the context we're going to consider that we have data in this infinite dimensional space. And so some examples of this is we can have a surface classification task where you have the continuous surface. Another one is if you have a PDE solution from time t, you want to predict time t plus 1. And that I'm talking about the continuous function, not just discretely many points. Or a third one is a graphon model of a brain network. All of these are sort of infinite dimensional objects. And we want to think of a learning problem where we can learn a theta that minimizes the loss on these data points. And one thing I want to make clear is that when we think of one data point in the infinity, that would be one object. So if we have a finite sample point cloud from that, we would have n points in the point cloud, but it would correspond to one element in the data set. And so the problem with this, as anyone watching this probably thought, is that compute memory is finite. So we can't actually use infinite dimensional data if we're doing some infinite dimensional learning problem. So what we do is we use finite dimensional data by sampling. And so we have some way of sampling from the data. For example, point clouds, you can just like sample randomly from the points. Or for graphs, there are some ways to do this by like cutting off edges and just sampling the nodes, or some more principled ways. And what this lets us do is it lets us formulate the problem instead in terms of finite dimensions. And then we can reformulate another loss function for the finite dimensional learning problem. And our hope, whenever we want to generalize, is that learning on this finite dimensional loss function is somewhat equivalent to learning on the infinite dimensional one. So infinite dimensional data, we want to approximate that with finite. Now, why do we expect this to work? Well, you can think of an example where you have some graph that only has like a complicated cycle or something that helps you solve the problem in like 20 dimensions or 30 dimensions. And if you're using 5 dimensions, you're not going to capture that and your learning isn't going to work. But generally, there's this idea is that there's this concept of transferability where you can generalize to new data sizes under certain assumptions. And it's based on the theory of representation stability. We're not going to go too much into that, and it's not really that necessary for understanding what we're doing. But you can see this paper if you want to learn more about that. But basically, we have a theoretical justification for why we expect this to work. And so here's a simple example. Normalized deep set, it's just we're defining a function on point clouds of n dimensions, and we're defining the function in such a way that it doesn't depend on n. Like it doesn't, like it works for any n. And so we have this like omega theta 1, which is applied to each point individually. G of theta 2 is applied to the mean of those points, all of them. So it kind of aggregates it from an n-dimensional object all the way to a fixed dimensional object, and then it gets an output. And so basically, this is all set up to the central question of this talk, which is how does the training dimension affect the learning dynamics and optimization of these any-dimensional models, i.e. how does optimizing on Ln affect optimizing on L infinity? And so the way we're going to answer this is that through this quantity we call dimensional efficiency. And so the way we do this is we can sort of reformulate the problem of dimensional generalization through the idea of a dimension-induced bias for gradient descent. Basically, having a different data dimension induces some expected bias in the gradient flow, which leads to different learned functions. So you can see here an informal version of that, where we can express the finite dimensional loss function for the normalized deep set case in terms of the infinite, plus some little bias perturbation of order 1 over n. And this is common in many any-dimensional models, this kind of construction. And it gives you a nice sort of way of thinking about optimizing how these two objectives are related. And so we use a key assumption here that at rate 1 over n to the a, we assume that this gradient of Ln goes to the gradient of L infinity for each theta. And so the reason why we do this is it's useful for the later parts of the talk, but mainly we need a limit for there to be a hope of transferring. If there's no limit, gradient of Ln doesn't go to gradient of L infinity, then gradient of Ln really doesn't help you learn L infinity. So there's not really any reason to do this. And as you saw in the previous slide, this kind of polynomial-esque convergence is ubiquitous in any dimensional architectures. And as we use later, the compute also increases polynomially with dimension. So this is a reasonable assumption, but we're going to use this later. So dimensional efficiency, consider gradient descent. You can see it's just, we're updating the parameters based on a learning rate and the gradient on finite dimensions. If we do a second order Taylor expansion of L infinity of theta t plus 1, we can get this inequality, which is a standard kind of optimization result. However, we're plugging it into this specific any dimensional kind of framework where we can bound the difference between the L infinity loss after taking a step in the Ln direction in terms of this quantity gamma n, which we call the dimensional efficiency. And you can see here, it's basically just a similarity between the n-dimensional gradient and the infinite dimensional gradient minus some smoothness term. And so what this basically does is it gives you kind of a quantity saying how much you're going to descend by, or you're guaranteed to descend by, based on the gradient of Ln and gradient of L infinity. When the gradient of Ln and the gradient of L infinity are unrelated, like near 0, this thing is going to be really small. And what that means is that taking a step in Ln is not really going to help you in taking the L infinity objective. So this is kind of a nice formalization of a result, of this kind of bias gradient descent perspective that kind of gives us an intuition about the any-dimensional problem. And yeah, so I just said this, we get a convergence rate. If we follow the infinite dimensional gradient, this is just straight from normal optimization, we get that the minimum, like the minimum grad norm squared, is bounded above by something of the sum of learning rate times 1 minus eta t L over 2. And if we use what we just did above and get a convergence rate on infinite loss following the finite dimensional gradients, we get a very similar structure of result, except the difference is instead of that 1 minus eta t L over 2, we get a gamma n there instead. And we can think of gamma n as smaller than 1 minus eta t L t over 2 in the regimes we care about. So it's basically saying it's a factor by which optimization is slowed from training on finite dimension. That convergence rate is going to get slower as the similarity between the two gradients goes down. So this gives us a nice way of like sort of understanding how much our current dimension is helping us learn on this infinite problem. It also provides the principle for choosing the data dimension throughout training, that you want to choose the data dimension to keep the dimensional efficiency sufficiently large so that you're still getting efficient training. If dimensional efficiency decays towards zero, what's going to happen is you're going to stop making progress on the infinite loss. So this gives a nice principle for choosing data dimension, but what's the issue? Why am I not saying that this is kind of done? We can just use the dimensional efficiency directly to pick the data dimension, and then we can train. Well, there are two problems with this. One, choosing the maximum n star might be wasteful in that at the beginning of training, you might not need that many dimensions to do well. So you might want to train on something like 10 dimensions at first, which might be more efficient. But later you might need a bigger dimension. So you shouldn't, if you start on that, you're going to do a lot of wastefulness at the beginning. And two, it turns out that you can't pick a fixed dimension that works. Every fixed n eventually runs out of dimensional efficiency. Now, what do I mean by that? Basically, in practice, what we observed is that the dimensional efficiency goes to zero with training. And here's some sort of quick intuition about it, but you can reformulate this objective in terms of these different terms, Q and this other term. And with convergence, it makes sense that this thing might go to zero. And so what we get is we have that this thing goes to zero as we train. So if we pick a fixed dimension, for any fixed dimension, it'll go to zero. So training will stop being as efficient. However, if we increase the dimension for a fixed theta t, what we get is that the dimensional efficiency will also increase. And that's very nice, because what that gives us is that we can fix this problem by increasing the dimension. And this motivates the following question, that how can we schedule the data dimension for compute efficient training of these models? Because I just said we can't pick one fixed dimension and expect it to be efficient throughout. So we're going to have to somehow schedule or change the data dimension throughout training. Well, the idea of what we do in this work is that we choose the dimension n, maximizing some measure of descent on the L infinity objective over the compute we use to be sort of efficient in that sense. So here's some sort of motivation for what we're trying to do. We want to choose the dimension nt at a given step to minimize the end loss under limited compute. So each training step has a roughly, like it's a lower bound, but a roughly decrease in loss proportional to eta t, gamma nt, and the norm of L infinity theta t squared. We got that from before. And we have compute roughly proportional to n to the b. This can be memory or this can be runtime, but you expect as like, for example, where b for graphs might be 2, with O of n squared, it's going to grow and it'll take longer. And so for a given step in training, what we do is we consider a greedy approach where we just kind of maximize this decrease in loss without the eta t in the other term over the compute n to the b. And this is supposed to give us an intuitive way of picking the right dimension to solve this thing, which will give us some maximal compute efficiency locally. Now, here's a theorem we have about the optimal n star. And when we have this n star being the solution of this maximum thing, where n is the current training dimension, and we're under a couple assumptions that I'm not going to go into in this talk, what we have is that we can explicitly compute the value of n star. And what it tells us is that it gives us some relation in terms of these quantities A and B, where if you remember, A was that assumption we made here on the rate that this gradient decays, and B is the sort of scaling, polynomial scaling of the compute. So what this kind of tells us is that it tells us that there's this factor of the optimal dimension depending on this ratio between the amount you gain by increasing the dimension and the amount you lose by increasing the dimension, which is the compute cost. And there's also dependence on this similarity term and the smoothness and the current dimension. And this has a really interpretable, nice value for the optimal dimensional efficiency. What it is that it gives you that basically the dimensional efficiency for a given, like for the optimal dimension, is basically the max you can have times A over A plus B. So it's weighting the ratio between A and B, where the gamma that's best is the one that kind of is in the middle and allows you to balance both alternatives. And so we come up with an algorithm based on this idea of we increase the dimension or we pick the dimension but via these computations. We come up with an optimal algorithm where what we do is throughout training, every couple epochs, we compute a gradient of big Ln. So we're training on a fixed dimension n. Then after a couple epochs, we calculate the gradient on some big n, where that's a proxy for the infinite dimensional gradient. And we compare that to the small n dimensional gradient. And we can compute n star with the previous formula we just had. And what that lets us do is it lets us get the optimal dimension that we can pick. And we can have a list of dimensions that we can choose from, which is natural in a problem where you're not going to have data of every dimension. You might have data of like 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. So based on this list, we basically pick the n on that list that's closest to this n star that we compute. And if it increases the dimension, what we do is we increase the dimension. Now, the reason we only increase the dimension is because of certain little computational details in the algorithm, where it can be unstable under certain training conditions, if you allow the dimension to decrease and increase and decrease. So this sort of matches the natural inductive bias, which is throughout training, you're going to need more precision to get things closer and more accurate. And so this is the idea of the algorithm, that we're going to save runtime on the individual epochs by training on small dimensions, and then evaluate whether to increase dimensions by computing this big gradient of Ln one time and using that to guess what sort of next dimension we want to use. And so we have some nice sort of results based on this, and it works out of the box without additional hyperparameter tuning. It doesn't require us to tune like for example, you can tune like schedules of dimension for specific problems. This is problem agnostic. It just, all we need is the A and the B, and it works for any of these. And what it also lets us do is it gives us a nice natural way of increasing the dimension. Like it'll always increase the dimension when we need it to, usually. And that gives us a sort of a natural way of keeping things efficient throughout training, and it actually can help us save runtime. And so here's a toy example that I think helps explain this decently well. And so what we have here is, and this is not an any-dimensional model, this is just using the assumption we used before, where we can sort of characterize the finite dimensional loss as being some infinite dimensional loss, i.e. this quadratic term, plus something O of 1 over n to the a. And using our method in this case, which matches the assumptions but is very simple, we get that our adaptive algorithm performs very well with respect to compute. As you can see, it's near the bottom of that graph there. And you can see on the right, the way that the dimension schedule kind of increases throughout training. You can see it gradually increases the dimension as the objective value goes down and the dimensional efficiency goes down. And so this gives a nice proof of concept of why this method works. And for a more rigorous example, we have the ModelNet 10 data set, or 40. And I showed an example of this at the beginning, but it's basically just a bunch of CAD files of these objects and we're classifying them like chairs or hats, stuff like that. And we're going to sample points from them, like as a point cloud, and we're going to evaluate the model on different dimensions of this and our algorithm of increasing the number of points in each point cloud. And so what we observe is that you can see here, if we look at the dimension 500 one, that's very inefficient with respect to compute, which suggests we've increased the dimension way too much. It's not needed to use that much dimension for the early parts of this problem. And what you can see with these smaller dimensions, and this is not super visible in the graph, but for smaller dimensions like 20, where we use a fixed, it goes down pretty fast and then it kind of levels off as the dimensional efficiency gets near zero. So you still don't get that same compute efficiency of that bottom graph that we want. But with our adaptive algorithm, we get that it automatically increases the dimension in such a way that it keeps near the bottom of this graph, where it increases the dimension to keep that things efficient. Now, it's important to note that you can tune like schedules that do better than this, of course, because what we're doing is a greedy, local, it's not entirely precise method. And you can see the linear schedules there. They do pretty well. But one thing that this method really does well is that you don't have to tune the linear schedules. If you put in a linear schedule where you're going a lot slower, I mean, a lot faster at increasing the dimension, it's going to be really bad. So you have to tune that like linearity or like how you want to increase the dimension for this specific thing. But for our algorithm, you don't have to do that. And that's really nice. And it does this in a relatively fast runtime compared to a fixed large dimension. And basically the concluding ideas of what we're talking about here is, so what we have is we define this quantity dimensional efficiency to characterize how the effect of the finite dimensional optimization objective on the infinite dimensional thing. And that provides a nice number that characterizes how much we're losing from using the smaller dimension. And this is a nice quantity, but the problem is that it decays during training empirically because of these, like, just we observe it in experiments. And basically, you can think of it as kind of running out of information, or like you've learned everything you can learn from the little, and you need to increase it to get more specific. And so, what we need to do is we need to increase the data dimension throughout training. And we can tune the dimension by increasing it when the dimensional efficiency gets too low, and that allows for more compute efficient training. And that's the idea of what our algorithm is doing, and for more runtime efficient training. And so, yeah, thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.
All right, let's smash those reaction buttons.